Hi, everybody. I am Sarah Abernathy with the Committee for Education Funding, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization of 119 different education associations, institutions, and others that together advocate for a greater federal investment along the education continuum. We have members that cover early ed, K through 12, higher ed, adult ed and vocational workforce development, and out of school educational resources like after school, libraries, museums, along with education research. And today we had planned this briefing to talk about the many ways that education funding has been in jeopardy or been cut this year. Did not know that today there would be this big announcement from the Department of Ed that I gather is coming out just about now, that will say that it has interagency agreements in place with, I believe, 4 other agencies to transfer almost every education program office out of the Department of Ed and into either Department of Labor, HHS, state, or Interior. We will talk more about that, and maybe some of the panelists will today. But Jamie, if you could put up the slides. I have 3 slides I wanted to kick off with, and then turn it over to our panelists. You can follow Ed on social media, follow CEF at Ed Funding, and our website has a lot of different information. Jamie, the next slide, please. Just wanted to mention again that there's been a lot that has been happening this year. I've been summing it up as, in one word, as chaos. And that's the impact of all the executive actions that the administration has made regarding Department of Ed and its programs and funding. It has withheld funding to states, to institutions, to specific grantees. It has laid off or encouraged to retire almost half the Department of Ed staff. They had tried to fire another 465 during the shutdown, but that is on hold legally until the end of January. There's a lot of lawsuits and different rulings at different levels of the judicial system that sometimes contradict each other about whether changes can go through or not. And behind all that is the attempt to eliminate the Department of Ed and some of the other agencies that support education funding. There's been actions from the Department of Ed, or I should say the administration, I'm calling silent rescissions, which is when they just don't spend money. They have canceled contracts, they have discontinued grants, they have withheld funding, they have transferred a lot of funding from one program to another, not following what the appropriations law from Congress had provided. In fact, we don't even know for sure exactly how the Department of Ed has allocated its fiscal year 25 funding because they've never posted their funding table for fiscal year 25. In addition, the budget reconciliation bill that Congress enacted and the president signed into law this summer made changes to education. Hundreds of billions of dollars of student aid was eliminated. There were Medicaid cuts that will affect schools, SNAP funding that students get, tax credit for private school vouchers. And then on top of that, the president's fiscal year 26 budget request to Congress and the House Appropriations Committee bill, in somewhat different ways, but overall both would slash Department of Ed funding by 15%. That's $12.4 billion in the coming year. But Congress hasn't yet enacted fiscal year 26 appropriations, as we saw with the shutdown. So education funding is flowing at whatever the Department of Ed says is current levels through January 30th, but we don't know what's happening next. Can I have the next slide, please? All of this is about the funding levels for the Department of Education and other agencies that have education funding in them. I tend to use Department of Ed as a proxy, and you can see the yellow lines show what funding has been going back to 2011, which for many years was the high water mark. The green line shows what Department of Ed funding would be had it kept pace with inflation. And currently, Department of Ed funding is $20 billion below the 2011 level in inflation adjusted dollars. And you can see the proposals from the president and the House and Senate Appropriations Committee that are still pending. Final chart, please. All of these cuts and proposed cuts are contradicted by what the American public wants. In poll after poll, it shows that a majority of voters want to increase investments in education and not cut them. All that said, I am now going to turn it over to different panelists who are CEF members who will introduce themselves and talk briefly about different areas of education that either have been cut already or that are in jeopardy or that have been in a lot of talk. So if you want to turn on the slides, and I will turn it over to Myrna Mandlowitz with the Council of Administrators of Special Ed to kick it off.
Thanks, Sarah. I appreciate it. As Sarah said, I represent the Council of Administrators of Special Education, known as CASE, and our members are the people in each of the school districts across the country who are responsible for implementing the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, that is providing services for eligible students with disabilities. I want to talk on, actually, I also want to mention there are close to 8 million students now across the country who are receiving services under the IDEA. That number continues to increase. I want to mention two issues today, and I guess they'll give me the high sign if I speak too long, but first of all, this is the 50th anniversary of the IDEA. This law was enacted 50 years ago and was signed by President Gerald Ford, and since that time has been bipartisan. We have always had support across Congress for funding for children with disabilities to make sure that they receive not just access to education, but quality education in the general education curriculum. The law 50 years ago included a promise from Congress to pay 40% of the excess cost of educating students with disabilities. Consistently over those 50 years, it's been about double the cost to educate a child with a disability as opposed to a non-disabled child. Right now, that 40% is still a pipe dream. We're at about 11%. And the continuing resolutions, the freezes in funding and so forth are just not adequate to meet the needs for serving these students. Not only do students with disabilities receive specialized instruction for the most part in the general education classroom, but they also receive specialized instructional support services such as occupational and physical therapy, speech therapy, mental health services that all enable them to access and participate actively in the general education curriculum. So the funding piece, critically, we need more funding. It's just, we talk about full funding of IDEA. Bills have been introduced repeatedly in Congress, but we are still far from that 40% promise of 50 years ago. The other thing I want to talk about briefly, as Sarah mentioned at the outset, are the moves of taking offices out of the Department of Education and moving them to other agencies through interagency agreements. The rumor began, I believe, with the Office of Special Education Programs. That's been a constant drumbeat. And I just want to mention a couple reasons why doing that would be so detrimental to students with disabilities. First of all, it's called the IDEA. The E stands for education. It is not a health law, and the rumor had been that it would be moved to the Department of Health and Human Services. There are medical needs that students with disabilities all have, but that is not what is provided under the IDEA. IDEA works best alongside general education. As I mentioned, most students with disabilities now are in the general education receiving a free, appropriate public education. And it is really important that the Office of Special Education Programs be able to coordinate all services because students with disabilities benefit from all education programs, not just the IDEA. We also know that the Department of Education has the expertise. Being special education is a very discrete field. We have people in the department who are really well-schooled and expert in being able to support state education agencies and local school districts to provide appropriate services. I think one of the most important things is it would send the wrong message about including kids with disabilities. We think of students with disabilities as general education students first, and moving OSEP, the Office of Special Education Programs, out of the U.S. Department of Education would separate them out again, which is what this law meant to change 50 years ago. And finally, it would weaken accountability. We want to make sure that the dollars that Congress appropriates are spent appropriately, that there's the monitoring from the U.S. Department of Education, of state departments of education, and in turn, state departments for districts, to make sure that the law is consistently applied, that children across all states, children with disabilities across all states, receive the services and supports they need to be successful in education. The last thing I'll just say before I turn it to our next speaker is that the Council of Administrators of Special Education has a very strong statement on its website. I'm happy to provide it to Sarah to send out to you about the importance of a federal presence in education and what that means to ensure that the rights and responsibilities under these laws are maintained and ensure that all students get the education that they need and they deserve. So now I'm going to turn it over to Erik Peterson, who will be talking about the after-school program.
Thanks so much, Myrna. Good morning from Anchorage, Alaska, and the Alaskan Out of School Time Conference, where I'm at this week. I'm Erik Peterson. I serve as Senior Vice President for Policy at the Afterschool Alliance. We're a national nonprofit that promotes access to quality after-school and summer learning programs. So families and students in the programs that serve them have had a lot of challenges this year. One of the programs that's helping support young people and communities is the 21st Century Community Learning Center program. I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. The federal evidence, this is a federal program, evidence-based initiative that helps local communities respond to needs. It's been going since 1998. The bipartisan support for the program has helped students in pre-K through 12th grade when school is out. So it helps boost student performance. It keeps young people engaged in their own education, provides enrichments, academic support, STEM education, sports and physical activity. It's also an opportunity for nutritious meals to be provided both after school and the summer, arts education, and more. The FY25 education FY25 education funding that was in the continuing resolution, full year continuing resolution that passed back in March by bipartisan vote, signed into law by the president. At that point, state education agencies should have been told, probably been the spring, early summer, their formula allotments for 21st Century Community Learning Centers so they could plan grant competitions and further plan the rest of the year. Those funds are forward funded. So actually fiscal year 25 is funding not just this past summer, but this current school year. Instead, however, on June 30th of this year, state education agencies were told about $6.8 billion in fiscal year 25 funding for 6 education programs would be withheld by the Office of Management Budget. There were not a lot of details. It was for a programmatic review, but there was no timeline or appeals process or any further details provided to states. That included $1.329 billion in funding for the 21st Century Community Learning Centers that serve about 1.4 million students, about 10,000 sites and communities in all 50 states and Washington, D.C. and the territories. Many summer learning programs that were funded with those 21st Century funds had already started in June. And state education agencies were counting on those fiscal year 25 funds to be able to reimburse programs for work done after July 1st. State education agencies actually were heroic in finding other funds, carryover funds, state funds that they were able to use to keep summer programs open, although some had to reduce the amount of hours. In areas where programs were unable to be maintained due to the withholding of funding, parents had to pick up their kids from programs, staff were laid off, young people lost out on those opportunities to learn. People did raise their voices as a result. Parents, students, superintendents, providers like Boys and Girls Club, Save the Children, YMCA, After School All-Stars, and others. Also law enforcement, pediatricians, educators, local leaders, who all made the case for why these programs are so important and what impact they have at the local level across a wide range of values. Senators and representatives joined in as well, both publicly and privately, sent joint letters. A letter led by Senator Capito of West Virginia with 10 Republicans asked for the funds to be released. Governors and state education officials weighed in publicly and privately. And eventually on July 21st, the 21st Century Community Learning Center funds were released. The other $5 billion in other education funds that had been withheld were also released on July 28th. However, the impacts really continued for a while. Staff had left programs due to the uncertainty of being paid. State education agencies are understandably concerned now about holding new grant competitions. Policymakers at all levels, I think, did get a better understanding of the importance of these programs and what they help at local levels and communities, how they impact children, families, and young people. Uncertainty remains for the fiscal year 26 funding, obviously with what's going on in Congress, but also with the president's proposed budget, which would eliminate dedicated 21st century funding. And we'll talk more about that with the panel. With that, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. And I'm going to turn it over now to Jason Scamenti with NAFIS.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, CEF, for hosting this discussion. I'm Jason Scamenti with National Association of Federally Impacted Schools, representing the approximately 1,100 districts that rely on the Impact Aid program. I want to talk about kind of three major developments this year that have placed extraordinary strain on federally impacted school districts. First off, the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, the RIF of Impact Aid staff, and breaking news from the department, from the administration's plans to dismantle major portions of the Department of Education. But first, it's important to briefly explain what Impact Aid is and why it's kind of uniquely vulnerable during lapses of appropriations. Impact Aid is one of the oldest federal education programs. Impact Aid was created in 1950, and we just celebrated its 75th anniversary in September. It exists because some school districts cannot raise the local tax revenue that most communities rely on, because their land is owned by the federal government. These include military installations, tribal lands, federally owned low-income housing, national parks, and other federal facilities. Because of the federal presence, districts lose property tax revenue that would otherwise fund teacher salaries, transportation, building operations, and basic day-to-day expenses. Impact Aid replaces those lost local dollars. Unlike most federal education programs, funds go directly to school districts' operating budgets, not through state formulas. That means districts depend on payments arriving on time to make payroll and keep schools functioning. Impact Aid is pretty unique among federal education programs in that it is not forward funded, so that funds being appropriated by this CR are being used in the current school year. When there are no funds, districts immediately face cash flow crises, and that vulnerability was front and center during this year's shutdown. The 44-day shutdown left Impact Aid school districts with zero certainty about when payments would come. Superintendents prepared for hiring freezes, delayed repairs, canceled purchases, and in some cases, short-term borrowing. Some school districts, especially in tribal and rural communities, rely on Impact Aid for 20, 30, or even 50% of their budget. A missed or delayed payment is not an inconvenience, it's destabilizing. Communication with the Department of Education also stopped, leaving districts unable to resolve application issues or verify payment timing. The shutdown was followed by a reduction in force at the Impact Aid office of nearly all of its staff. Thanks to congressional action, the current continuing resolution, the RIF has been reversed and Impact Aid staff is back at work. We are grateful for that, but the backlog created during the shutdown and the RIF period is real, and districts are still feeling the effects of the office work to catch up. And now this morning, we're all seeing reports that the administration plans to move multiple education department offices to other agencies, effectively dismantling key departments of the key parts of the Department of Education. The administration has already argued that the shutdown proved the department is unnecessary, a claim that is directly contradicted by the experience of Impact Aid districts. And that's what, and we've already used interagency agreements to move other programs out of ed. Any fragmentation or relocation of Impact Aid would carry real risk for the accuracy, speed, and reliability of payments. The bottom line is Impact Aid needs stable on-time appropriations, a fully staffed and functioning Impact Aid office, and protection from administrative restructuring that could disrupt program delivery. Federally impacted communities educate military-connected students, honor treaty obligations, and support federal installations that benefit the entire nation. They deserve a federal partner that is reliable and fully capable of meeting its responsibilities. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jacqueline King from AACTE.
Good afternoon. My name is Jackie King, and I'm with the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education. AACTE represents more than 500 public and private post-secondary institutions and other organizations that prepare professional educators. The Learning Policy Institute estimates that 1 in 8 teaching positions are either vacant or filled by individuals who are not fully certified for their assignments. In addition, schools report persistent shortages of other key personnel, such as school counselors and nurses. The size and severity of shortages varies from state to state and community to community, with shortages most severe in rural and low-income urban schools and in key fields such as special education, science, and math. Despite the clear need to produce more qualified educators, in February of this year, the administration began to cancel grants that help to fund innovative educator preparation programs across the country. Hundreds of grants have been canceled mid-year and discontinued at the conclusion of the fiscal year across almost every federal program that funds educator preparation. No new grant competitions have occurred despite funding under the FY25 continuing resolution. These cancellations have given us a window into the impact on future educators and the schools and communities that they serve. To give you just one example, Prairie View A&M University, a historically Black institution in a rural community northwest of Houston, had its Hawkins grant canceled that was funding dozens of candidates in a year-long teacher residency program. As a result, not only are these candidates losing the funds that they were relying on to pay for their education, but the schools where they were working lost staff during the middle of the school year. Now we fear that Congress will make these cuts permanent. The president's proposed budget and the House Labor HHS Education Bill eliminate funding for Title IIA, which supports ongoing teacher prep, professional development, the Teacher Quality Partnerships Program supporting effective educator development, and the Teacher and School Leader Incentive Fund grants. The Senate bill retains support for these programs at FY24 levels. Federal investment in these programs have funded innovative pathways such as dual enrollment, grow your own programs, and teacher residencies. Thousands of teacher candidates have relied on funding from these programs to complete their programs. In short, these programs have made a difference for our nation's schools, and their elimination would have a significant impact on the educator workforce. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to turn the mic over to my colleague, Stephanie Giesecke.
Thank you, Jackie. Hi, I'm Stephanie Giesecke with the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities. We represent all the private nonprofit colleges and universities across the country. It's about a sector of about 1,700 institutions, and that includes everything from the name brand Ivy League that you all know to Christian colleges, women's colleges, small liberal arts colleges. We have colleges in 395 congressional districts, so there is probably one in your backyard. I'm going to talk about two quick things on the student aid front, something that is done and something that has been proposed. So on the what's already happened category, this summer's passage of H.R. 1, the reconciliation package, included deep cuts to graduate student loans, about $45 billion over 10 years. And in doing that, it eliminates the Grad Plus program, which allows graduate students to borrow in the federal student loan program up to the cost of attendance, which includes books, housing, food, transportation, things that are not tuition. The reconciliation bill also caps unsubsidized graduate loans at lower caps than they are previously, and really limits the availability of graduate loans for non-professional degrees. These provisions go into effect this coming July 1st, 2026, and will have, especially the two combined, will have a big impact on the workforce pipeline in areas, especially in healthcare, like nursing, occupational therapy, physical therapy, those kinds of degree programs. And what could happen is it will either force students to borrow in the private market to continue their education in these fields, or just decide not to pursue them at all. And these are areas where there is a great need across the country, especially in the healthcare fields. So that's kind of one of the big things that's already happened. It's done. It's going into effect in July. Then on the proposed side of things for student aid, for fiscal 26, the proposals that we're seeing, the president's budget proposed to eliminate the Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, which is an additional grant for low-income students, and to deeply cut the Federal Work-Study program, as well as eliminate the TRIO program and the Gear Up program. The House has both the House and Senate have written their bills. The House bill is similar to the president's budget in that it eliminates SEOG and cuts work study, but not quite as deeply as the president's proposal. But the Senate bill maintains funding for all of the student aid programs. I will highlight that across all of these, the Pell Grant program is not targeted for cuts or changes even. So the Pell Grant program is kind of off in a safe place. And we continue to be concerned about cuts to the other programs. I will just be quick here and say that NICU provides what we call our student aid data sheets, where you can see what your congressional district gets in student aid funding or your state gets in student aid funding, and this includes not just data for our institutions, but for all institutions in those states and districts. I'm happy to answer questions later, but I will pass it off now to my colleague, Jim Hermes.
Thanks very much, Stephanie, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. As Stephanie mentioned, my name is Jim Hermes. I'm the Associate Vice President of Government Relations for the American Association of Community Colleges. We represent the nation's 1,024 community colleges, the vast majority of which are public institutions of higher ed or two-year colleges. I'm going to talk, we have a very broad funding agenda at AACC that gets into, of course, all the higher ed programs as well as workforce development and so forth. But I'm going to talk about a particular area, and that is the Title III and Title V Higher Education Act programs. For those of you that aren't familiar, Title III and Title V of the Higher Education Act authorize a variety of programs that are awarded to institutions of higher education. Hence, they are called institutional aid programs in the law. That's a bit of a misnomer because a lot of it, as I'll talk about a little bit in a second, a lot of the uses of funds made of those funds do, in fact, directly benefit students at those institutions. So there's really kind of a mix in terms of who's being helped there. So some of the programs under Title III and Title V include the historically Black colleges and universities and the tribal colleges and universities. Those are programs that go to defined sets of institutions. Other programs award competitive grants to eligible institutions that enroll, and I'll talk a little bit in a second about what eligible institution means for all the programs that I'm about to talk about. But some of those programs must enroll a minimum percentage of students from a particular demographic group. These include the Title V Developing Hispanic Serving Institutions program. And then under Title III, you have the Alaska Native and Native Hawaiian Serving Institutions, predominantly Black institutions, Native American Serving Non-Tribal Institutions, and finally Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander Serving Institutions. And then finally, there is one other Title III A program, as we call them, and that is the Strengthening Institutions Program. And that provides funds to eligible institutions without a student demographic requirement. So that's, in a nutshell, that's kind of the Title III and Title V landscape. There's a lot of permutations within those programs in terms of discretionary funding and mandatory funding and specific purposes for some of those programs. But that sort of gives you the gist if you're not familiar. For all these competitive programs, the ones I just kind of listed out, an eligible institution is an institution that has low educational and general expenditures and a relatively high enrollment of students receiving need-based student aid. So in other words, these are institutions that are under-resourced and that serve disproportionately high numbers of economically disadvantaged students. So that's kind of, that's across the board. And then of course, those demographic requirements come in on top of that. As a result of that definition of eligible institution of higher education, community colleges are strongly represented in most of these programs. And that's why I'm talking about them with you all today. Institutions use Title III and V grant funds for a variety of purposes, including academic support programs, faculty and academic program development, equipment purchases and facilities renovation, and other activities that kind of shore up the some of the back office functions of these colleges and universities. Remember, these are by definition kind of under-resourced institutions. Suffice it to say, these funds are really vital to these under-resourced institutions and the students that they serve. Support for these programs has historically been bipartisan and remains so, as evidenced by the fact that they are generally level funded in both the House and Senate Labor, HHS, and Education Appropriations bills. In its FY26 budget proposal, the Trump administration also proposed level funding for these programs. However, after litigation challenging the constitutionality of the Title V program, the Hispanic Serving Institutions Program, the administration reversed course and declared that all the Title III and V programs that base their eligibility in part on enrollments of a certain demographic group were unconstitutional. The administration, therefore, did not award new or continuation grants for these programs in FY25, and that's contrary to congressional intent. As part of that, also, all these programs that I've been talking about are under the higher education account in the Labor, HHS, and Education bill. And beyond the non-funding of the Title III and Title V programs, you also saw the administration kind of unilaterally eliminating the Title VI international education program as well. And then in turn, a lot of these funds were redirected to the HBCU and tribally controlled colleges, universities programs under that higher education account. So a lot of things being done there by the administration, again, as I said, contrary to congressional intent. So bottom line is that AACC and the other members of CEF urge Congress to restore funding for these important programs in FY26 and include language, ideally in the legislation, to ensure that the administration spends the funds on these programs as Congress intends in the current fiscal year. Thanks very much, everyone. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kevin Marr at the American Library Association.
All right, thank you, Jim. So I'm Kevin Maher with the American Library Association, and ALA represents the nation's 123,000 libraries. We're the national voice for all libraries, including public, private, K-12 schools, academic and post-secondary educational institutions, and specialized libraries. We offer no fee access to information and services at all stages of life and education attainment. Our federal funding priorities include $211 million for the Library Services and Technology Act, administered by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and also $30 million for the Innovative Approaches to Literacy program in support of the work of school librarians, administered by the Department of Education. The timeline this year has been fast, but on March 14th, the president issued an executive order announcing an intent to eliminate the Institute of Museum and Library Services. All employees were RIF'd on March 31st. Grants were canceled on April 3rd. And as two lawsuits were filed, ALA was party to one of these lawsuits, and the courts forced the return of employees and some grants to be restored. But now we see through attrition and buyouts and retirements, the staff at IMLS is about 1/2 of what it used to be. As a result of the grants, you know, the grants been reinstated have largely been in the 21 plaintiff states that are part of the Rhode Island lawsuit. But in the grants in the non-plaintiff states largely have been canceled. And in addition, there's a lot of uncertainty. We've seen grants canceled, such as in Iowa, canceled projects such as the Iowa Resident Artist Program in Kentucky. The Filson Historic Society Collection, a $13,000 grant was canceled there. Alabama grant was canceled for the Oneonta Public Library, which provided materials to youth at probation centers. And because of the uncertainty in all the states, we're hearing a lot of preparation for potentially losing funding. There have been hiring freezes in a number of state library agencies and libraries that have gotten relied on a lot of this funding. Some states have already, state library agencies have reduced their staff. We're hearing from our school librarians that there's already been discussion of shifting because of the Department of Education cuts in those grants. They're shifting, talking about shifting away from the school library funds. Some libraries have seen that staff has been kept on, but they have no funding to purchase materials in the future. A lot of states are telling us that they're expecting reductions in consortium, statewide, and regional services for patrons, such as interlibrary loan programs or statewide subscriptions that libraries just wouldn't be able to afford on their own without this federal funding as well. So we're seeing a lot of preparation for possibly losing this funding and reduction in services already. So with that, that's a quick summary, but I'll turn this back to Sarah.
Well, thank you all for giving this quick overview. And I feel like I should say that we could have easily had like 8 more boxes up here with CEF members talking about other programs that have either seen their funding cut or are in jeopardy, and just to list a couple areas that are really big, and not that the small funding cuts aren't equally important, but the president's budget and the House Appropriations Committee both proposed to zero out adult education for this coming year. They both proposed to zero out what's known as Title II, which is the teacher and school leader training state grants. They proposed to eliminate the arts, ready to learn, promise neighborhood. Oh, and the other really big one is all of English language acquisition, which is $890 million. So there's a lot of programs that are at risk that we haven't talked about yet. And I think we will probably do some other webinars giving others a chance to feature that. With that, I wanted to open up. If any of you have questions you'd like the panelists to answer, please feel free to write them in the Q&A. And we will start with a couple that we already have. One is a general question, and you don't all need to answer this, but if anyone has something to add, you've talked about the considerable uncertainty and withholding or lateness of funding for various different reasons, either because the shutdown stopped impact aid funding going out. And as a budget geek, I just have to say, love that Jason mentioned that they are not forward funded, but in the education world, most of the Department of Ed's funding, because it doesn't make sense to give funding to schools on October 1st for the year that they are already started in August, almost every program in the K through 12 world, except for impact aid, is forward funded, meaning that their fiscal year 25 funding only got to them in July of this year that is being used for this current year. But impact aid lives paycheck to paycheck, like many people do. It is not forward funded. In the higher ed world, there's a combination of money because students get grants and loans for the current school year, but are also making decisions about where to go based on the grants and aid that they can get for the next school year. So my question to any of you who want to answer is the fact that fiscal year 26 funding, and we started fiscal year 26 on October 1st, it isn't yet known. Even if the programs wouldn't be getting the money now, they would be planning their budgets knowing what they would get for fiscal year 26. How is the delay in Congress setting fiscal year 26 funding levels for education impacting the services that your programs would be providing for teaching and learning? It's a free for all, whoever wants to answer.
I'll jump in, Sarah. I think, you said it, that for IDEA, but for school districts generally, K-12 school districts, they are already starting the planning process for the next school year. And it's very, very difficult without they really rely on the appropriations process running on schedule. If the appropriations are done as they should be by September 30th, and school districts can fold that in, that very vital information, even though the federal piece is not the majority of the dollars that go for school districts, that is really critical in making decisions about budgeting for the next school year. So, if they don't have those dollar numbers in front of them, then it's really hard to budget. And this constant churn and uncertainty, particularly now with educator shortages being what they are, this makes it even more difficult to think about filling those empty positions and those vacant positions and so forth. So really having the train run on time is critical to school districts getting their budgets in place for the next school year.
I can speak to student aid. For colleges and financial aid administrators, packaging for incoming freshmen, colleges kind of need to know what the appropriations are, especially what the Pell Grant maximum will be by about March, before it's panic time. Student aid is forward funded, as you mentioned, Sarah. So it's better if colleges know, about December, January, what the student aid funding will be, so that as they package over the spring, they know what they can offer incoming freshmen for the academic year in the fall, which that money for the fall starts July 1.
Yeah, I would just add for community colleges, in terms of some programs I talked about. I mean, quite obviously, the redirection of the Title III and Title V programs that all my members were expecting to receive, because remember, a lot of those were continuation grants, so they were already grantees under the program. That obviously caused a lot of disruption and the loss of services to students and so forth. What I didn't really talk about was a lot of the programs, other programs these are all under the higher education account, as I mentioned earlier. A lot of the other programs that did wind up being funded, two things happened. One is we did see some cancellation of individual grants in those programs. And then the other thing was, and that was also disruptive, is the fact that they went out very, very late in the day. So C Campus, this is a child care program, the Strengthening Institutions program the one Title III program that wasn't disrupted, and others basically went out in the last month of the fiscal year, and well beyond when they're supposed to go out. And so even delays can cause a lot of havoc on college campuses, which we definitely heard about.
I've been saying that to go back to my favorite word about this, that the chaos and uncertainty is absolutely having the impact of less funding, because if school districts, if college campuses, if students, if institutions can't count on the federal funding coming through, even when they see, for instance, in fiscal year 25, where the continuing resolution said keep everything even, and then the Department of Ed said, actually, we're going to move money around, we're not going to fund this program, we're going to discontinue that grant that we've had, it's a 5-year grant and this is year 3. that means that going forward, those institutions, grantees are not going to count on the federal funding coming through. And by necessity, they're going to prepare budgets that don't count on it. And that means less investment in teaching and learning, less support, because if you can't count on the federal share coming through, then you don't want to count on it. And you build a budget that is smaller. So even when funding might eventually be approved, if it's not approved on time for the same services, for the same institutions, it plays havoc with planning budgets, and budgets will not, that budgets will shrink for education. I have a couple other questions I could sort of pick and choose. Myrna, you already talked about how the administration has said that it wants to move special ed to the Department of Health and Human Services, which doesn't appear to have been part of today's grant announcements. And I'll put some links in the chat in a moment to the Department of Ed's materials that just went out, and also to their existing organizational chart for anyone who wants to see how Department of Ed offices currently are set. But Myrna, what would be the impact on, if, remember, the president's budget proposed to eliminate all different special ed programs and put all the money in the main state grant program. What would be the impact of that, or moving special ed to Health and Human Services on the provision of services and funding for students with disabilities?
Well, I'll speak to the block grant proposal, and we're very pleased that it's neither in the Senate nor the House bill, but this is something that comes up fairly regularly about block granting funds. For IDEA, the president's budget proposal included rolling 6 of the IDEA programs into the main K-12 block grant, main K-12 grant. State grant program, and that included rolling in the preschool program, which currently has its own line item, and then what we call Part D of the IDEA. And Part D of the IDEA are competitive discretionary grants. And it was basically said in the president's budget that, the states could take on running these grant competitions, which are for personnel preparation, parent training and information, technology and media, technical assistance and dissemination, all those things that we think of as the framework for IDEA. The economies of scale of having that done at the federal level, states do not have the capacity to have a whole staff system that will develop a grant proposal, go through what needs to be done to determine the eligibility criteria, run the competition, and then maintain the program by having program officers or whatever to follow those grants. So that would really be harmful to IDEA. Those programs really underpin, and I would really once again highlight the personnel preparation grants, which have been under the gun. See Jackie nodding because she works with this as well. The educator shortage in this country is critical, and special education along with STEM programs are the areas that have the most critical shortages. So anything that disrupts the flow of those critical grants to the preparation programs around the country would be extremely harmful to what ends up being very dangerous for not having well-qualified, trained staff to work with students with disabilities in districts around the country.
Thanks, Myrna. That leads me to thinking of a question for Jackie, taking one that you talked about the Department of Ed's unilateral action that has eliminated almost all funding for programs to educate future teachers. If this continues for the coming year and possibly for 2 more years of this administration, what impact would that have on the looming educator shortage that you mentioned?
It would absolutely exacerbate it, Sarah. It's a combination, I think, too, with the student aid cuts. Stephanie mentioned the impact on the healthcare workforce. There's also a major impact on the education workforce. Many, many educators are going back for graduate education to become special educators if they've previously, for example, been an elementary school teacher, well, they're not going to have the kind of access to student aid, in particular student loans, that they previously had, and the kinds of programs like personnel prep under IDEA, programs like grants that have funded school counselors through the Safer Communities Act. All of those programs ending simultaneously will have such a significant impact on the capacity of folks to become educators, and for ongoing professional education to step into some of those specialized roles that our schools absolutely need. So the impact will be severe, and it will fall disproportionately, I fear, on the students in greatest need. Students in our rural communities, students in our urban communities, students who need special education services or English language acquisition. Those are going to be the kids and communities and families that feel the greatest impact from all of this.
That makes me think of a point that education funding is not a monolith of a chunk of funding that goes for a thing. It is a lot of investments in different types of teaching and learning, and a lot of what it is in the K through 12 world, particularly, but following through to higher ed, is investments in jobs. For a lot of rural school districts, the school is the largest employer, and when it gets money for a new teacher or for new services, that is actually paying for a job for someone who's working. So it's actually a jobs issue as well as what that teacher is, the services the teacher is providing. Same thing for investments in other areas. I wanted to ask a question, either maybe for Stephanie or for Jim, but about higher ed. Stephanie outlined the changes to student aid enacted through the reconciliation bill, and the fact that the president's budget request includes additional steep cuts to student aid, including eliminating the supplemental educational opportunity grant, which sort of goes along with Pell grants. It also eliminates the TRIO programs. The House Appropriations Committee's bill for next year also slashes work study and eliminates other student aid. If these types of federal support are eliminated or drastically cut, what would be the impact on students who want to attend college? And Jim, I don't know if you want to sort of talk about community colleges, if there's any difference. I know that community colleges are often cheaper, the tuition is lower, but there's also students for whom the elimination of one grant might make the difference, I think, in attending or not attending college.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are. I mean, even though what you just said is true, that community colleges have lower tuitions than other sectors of higher ed. It's very, very important to remember that the just kind of the economic peril that so many of our students are in, and the challenges that they face day to day, and the loss of a Pell Grant or SEOG or federal work study, any one of those things can easily knock a student off their course in higher education, or prevent them from ever accessing higher education in the first place. And I think, and just kind of getting back a little bit to what you were just talking about a minute ago in terms of jobs in communities, it's also, well, two things are important to remember. One is that, for a lot of our institutions, and I think this goes equally true for both Stephanie's and my members, they are, the majority of my members anyway, are rural serving institutions, small institutions, where the effect of these programs is really quite amplified to an extent. And then, these are all, I mean, if you think about them in the abstract, you might not think that they would be all that, so important in terms of, this particular grant and the help it provides. But it's really important to think about in the specific context of the students that are attending our institutions and how important they are in their lives.
Thanks. And there's a question someone has asked about for Stephanie, which was how would we expect the FAFSA to work accordingly and provide financial aid on time once the Department of Ed begins to deteriorate, especially for public state schools, which I know is not your area of expertise, but the two of you know everything.
Well, the FAFSA is the FAFSA. So regardless of where you go to college. I have been on this webinar at the same time the press releases were coming out and the White House discussion was going on. So a little bit on the fly here. My understanding is that what they have put out does not address federal student aid, the Office of Federal Student Aid. There have been rumors that FSA and FAFSA and the student aid programs could move to Treasury, but it sounds like they did not announce that today from what I understand.
That's my understanding as well.
My understanding is that everything should continue smoothly. The shutdown, for example, did not shut down the Office of Federal Student Aid. Just for comparison.
Thanks. And I think for those who are, I did put the link to the Department of Ed's org chart, which I have to keep referring to because Office of Post-Secondary Education is different from Office of Financial Student Aid. And to the outside world, you would think this is all about helping college students and colleges, but not exactly. So
could I just add a little to your previous question?
Sure.
About the elimination of SEOG and work study? Along the same lines that Jim was talking about, I guess two things. Private colleges and universities across the country are definitely community anchors and are sometimes the biggest employer in the region. And for low-income students, you know, you have the Pell Grant as the foundation of a federal student aid package. And then you build on that with supplemental educational opportunity grants, which campuses match the federal dollars, and it gives the financial aid administrator flexibility in how that grant is awarded, whether at the beginning of a student's career or it allows flexibility for when financial circumstances change unexpectedly. Those programs are really important to keep students in college. So SEOG and work study are really important, not just for access for low-income students, but for persistence to degree completion is why we see those as very important.
Thanks. And there's another question submitted about the challenges for career technical education, adult education, now that there's an interagency agreement to have those programs administered by Department of Labor. And unfortunately, we don't have anyone who works specifically on that. I don't know if anyone up here wants to has information, or if you want me to say a little bit of what I know. Jim?
Yeah, I mean, community colleges are heavily involved in both those programs for sure. We haven't heard, I mean, to be honest, we haven't heard too much quite yet about, any particular ramifications that colleges are facing in those programs as a result of the interagency agreement, which is basically sort of the model and the forerunner of everything that was announced today. But we're keeping a close eye on it. It did involve the transfer of actual people from the Department of Education to the Department of Labor to help keep running those programs. So, well, and I think the only thing we've heard a little bit about is, some little bumps in the road in terms of because the payment system for people to draw down their monies, is now under DOL, and people are needing to that haven't been used to that, need to get used to that. So it's something that we're continuing to watch, but it's sort of early days still. Huh?
And also, a lot of the time that this interagency agreement has been in place, both Department of Labor and Department of Ed were shut down. So there has not been a ton of experience yet about how this will work. This interagency agreement for career technical and adult ed to move, well, I'm sure they would say it's not to move the administration of these programs to Department of Labor is the model that the rest of these are being based on, as far as I can tell. And I think what their statutes say, in the Department of Ed, there shall exist an office to do such thing. And I think the way that the administration is stepping around that is that there will technically still be those offices in the Department of Ed where they will have political staff who are there. So they still exist, but the responsibilities and the administration of the programs will be moving to these other agencies. Big question is what will happen to the existing career staff who work on those programs. The continuing resolution prohibits any rifts at federal agencies until the continuing resolution expires on January 30th. So I think jobs may be secure, whether people are put on leave and or are transferred or whatever. I don't know what will happen. Again, all the stuff that came out as we were talking here. So I haven't seen exactly what will happen. My guess is there will be some folks who have standing who may protest these moves and these interagency agreements, but it's based on a model that so far has gone through, as opposed to some of the rifts and the proposals to close, for instance, as Kevin was talking about, the Institute for Museum and Library Services. I always grew up with IMLS stands for, I think that's right. But that there's lawsuits that have stopped a lot of things, whereas the lawsuit that allowed almost half the Department of Ed staff to be fired this spring, the Supreme Court said you can go ahead and do that as long as the department can meet its statutory requirements, obligations. And I think you're going to start hearing people say that the statutory obligations are not being met when requirements for data and tests and results and grants are not being put out. But right now, lack of information has really hindered. Lack of transparency about what the Department of Ed is doing and where it's spending its money makes it harder to know whether the obligations are being met. I wanted to ask Erik, if Congress cut funding for elementary and secondary education and consolidated most surviving funding into a single block grant to states, as the president's budget request does, states could make different decisions about what to fund and what to cut. What do you think would happen to after-school funding, which the president's budget seeks to eliminate as a separate program?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. The president's budget for 26 does propose a couple of consolidations, but one would take 18 programs that are currently about $6.8 billion and collapse it down into one single program that would be about $2 billion. So it's not just consolidating, it's also a significant cut to those programs. All 18 of those, one of which is 21st Century Community Learning Centers, serves very specific purposes. And so while the state education agencies and perhaps locals, depending on how this would work, there's a lot of details that are not in that proposed budget. One of the challenges, in addition to the question of whether programs funding would flow to programs through schools, is currently under 21st Century. It's not just schools that get grants to do after school and summer programs, but it's also nonprofit organizations, charter schools, faith-based organizations, colleges and universities, park and rec departments, public libraries, a wide set of actors that work at the local level and respond to local needs, that provide very specialized programs in some areas that supplement and complement what schools are doing. And so a block grant that flows through state education agencies and schools, it's unclear that those organizations would continue to receive support. At the same time, the infrastructure piece here is really critical. And when we talk about sort of the role of Department of Ed, but also the role of the state education agencies with the funds that they receive, it's a formula type grant where 21st Century funds go by formula to state education agencies, and they sort of hybrid at the state level do competitive grants to these other organizations who apply for 3 to 5 year grants. But there's a chunk of those funds that are available through 21st Century that help with evaluation, quality, build capacity for local programs, support staff, and training. The accountability piece of all this, the data collection, that really ensures that we're getting the outcomes and the results that we need and want from these federal funds. And when you take away and collapse 21st Century, even though allow after school or summer would, according to the proposal, be an allowable use, you lose all that infrastructure. And therefore, we're not sure that we would continue to see the outcomes and the needs met that are vital under this program.
Thanks. And makes me think of a question for Kevin. The odd situation that the president budget eliminates funding for IMLS and the executive order eliminated IMLS, but both the House and Senate appropriations bills have put funding in for library services. So clearly it has a strong constituency in Congress and among the public. What do you think are some of the, I think libraries serve purposes beyond just education. Obviously, libraries are libraries, but what are some of the most important education services to highlight as the funding debate continues?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And actually, I want to go back one point about the CTE program. One of the issues that we have from the library standpoint is it's no pun intended, but sort of an educational challenge where libraries are always trying to have to redefine themselves for all of these new situations where we need to show and demonstrate and remind Department of Education or Department of Labor that libraries are an important role have an important role in the success of these programs. And one of the concerns is that that the new structure would eliminate services for adults with the greatest need for basic literacy, numeracy, digital skills. But some of the services that could be jeopardized if IMLS funding were to be challenged, and we're constantly talking about these programs to Congress is we provide no fee access to communities often on the margins, rural, tribal, seniors, underserved communities that don't have access to the modern technology, modern economy and society without services that are supported by IMLS funding and the grants such as lifelong learning, such as the Ohio Summer Learning Program or Strengthening Communities, Washington State subgrants for rural communities for Wi-Fi access, and FANSACs and IMLS funding enhances access to information and technology such as Kansas Talking Book Program for those who are print disabled. The grants support preserving history, such as the Montana History Portal, supports economic activities, such as the Kentucky Department of Libraries workforce subgrants. And all of these things are important in many ways to the communities that are supported, and many of these programs wouldn't be able to continue without the support of IMLS grants. So those are some of the things that we would we talk about and that Congress is hearing, I think, some of our messages there.
Thanks. And someone in the Q&A from the National Coalition for Literacy answered the question that one of their concerns about the interagency agreement to transfer career technical education adult ed responsibilities to the Department of Labor is their concern that the new structure will eliminate services for adults with the greatest need for basic literacy, numeracy, and digital skills. The deal that it's not a deal. The interagency agreements announced today to move most K through 12 programs also to Department of Labor. I find it really hard to imagine that department that is concerned about workforce training and worker protections has the same ability and knowledge and interest in understanding how homeless education, Title I, the programs that help migrant and economically disadvantaged students learn, those are not the same. I mean, all federal agencies hopefully want to do the best that they can by the American public, but they don't have the same skills and knowledge and goals and training to provide these services. And you may have noticed that Secretary of Education and the Department of Ed's Twitter feed have been sort of flippantly saying, like, we were gone, did you miss us? You didn't even notice. But in fact, that's not right. The reality is, as Jason talked about for Impact Day, they went without funding for 44 days. And I guarantee that those school districts and the people in charge of the budgets noticed that the funding wasn't flowing. And the fact that, it's sort of an artifact of the timing of when the shutdown happened, that most of the K through 12 money had already gone out to states. But having lawyers, having trained staff to provide technical assistance, having people who can make sure that the funding flows. There was one day the Department of Ed's website was down. that actually does impact people's ability to get information about the services that the department provides. Jason, since impact aid is the one, as far as I know, I mean, for instance, Head Start, which is a Department of Health and Human Services, also not forward funded. So when funding was stopped for 43 days, Head Start centers did not get funding. What would happen on February 1st if, when this continuing resolution ends, if Congress has not either enacted another continuing resolution or not enacted full year funding? Like, does it make a difference that the funding, that the stoppage of funding is farther into the school year? You made it, you mentioned that some school districts could maybe move money around, but does that become harder and harder to do as the school year progresses?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, impact aid payments, most school districts receive 2 to 4 impact aid payments throughout the school year, beginning in around mid-October. I think in FY25, I think 140 districts had started receiving payments by October 15th. So we use that as our metric to know that, schools were going without money by mid-October. We did a survey of about 90 of our members from October 17th to November 3rd. They talked about kind of when they would need their payments. Most of them said December through February is when they need those payments to avoid major consequences. They all discussed, ending their, junior Air Force ROTC program, ending after school programs, schools closing. These schools, on top of, having limited funds, because of the federal footprint in their district, they have little to no bonding capacity. They cannot go to voters and ask for money even on regular cycles. It affects their ability to plan long-term for things like capital improvements. These are schools that, need that money as it comes out and, are so vulnerable. And it was, a little surprising for us, for the secretary to be discussing how no one would notice that the department was gone when our members were, going to their school boards and pulling the emergency brake and on certain important things for students.
Right, and this leads me to the last question I'll take, which is someone asked that aren't rural school districts likely to be most impacted by federal education cuts since they don't have the tax base to replace federal cuts? And the answer is yes. If you look at generally in the K through 12 world, excluding impact aid districts, I shouldn't say excluding, but I mean, apart from that, federal funding accounts for somewhere around on average 11% of a school district's budget, but that varies wildly because it often runs along blue and red lines, but the states that provide less per student funding and the localities that have less of a tax base, by definition, the federal funding they get is a bigger share of their total budget. So when the federal funding is cut, it impacts those rural or poorer states much more than it impacts some of the wealthier states that spend more of their own money on education. That tends to follow along blue and red, but not exclusively lines. Some of it follows along population. And some states have more revenue from things like oil than others. So in closing minute, I don't know if anyone has any final point they want to make. I think this has been really informative at giving the big picture about the fact that there's a lot of things in flux right now, a lot of unknowns, a lot of cuts that have already taken place, and real fundamental changes in the way the federal role for education is being provided this year. Does anyone want to make a final comment? A question?
Sarah, I just will add one thing. You were talking about moving the Office of Elementary and Secondary to Department of Labor and whatever. I guess I would just say that there is some difference in philosophy about the purpose of education. It's not just to train folks for jobs or whatever, but it's really to develop curious, interested, well-rounded human beings. So I think, with that frame, that's why having a Department of Education that houses all of these programs is so critically important.
I would definitely agree that having a more diffuse and less strong focus on education is not going to do anything to improve education in this country. Well, thanks to everyone who's attended. CEF has a bunch of resources on its website, including our annual budget book that has contact information for the CEF members who wrote each article. So if Hill staff or the public have questions about a program, there's contact information for an expert right at your fingertips. Our website is cef.org. We will follow up with some materials to everyone, but this will be posted on our website tomorrow. So thanks everybody for sharing your information and expertise, and we'll look forward to being in touch. Bye.